South Africa has one of the highest rates of public protests in the world. Earlier this year, service delivery protests dominated the news, and now students are in the spotlight again. Professor Jane Duncan has written a book titled Protest Nation, The Right to Protest in South Africa. She joins us via Skype this morning. Jane, a very good morning to you, and thanks for your time. Your book, Protest Nation, The Right to Protest in South Africa. South Africans are aware they do have a right to protest. What does your book address? What does it say about it?
Well, good morning, and good morning to your viewers. What I wanted to focus on is how the right to protest is actually being put into practice in South Africa. And I focused particularly on the role of municipalities, because I know from my own experiential knowledge and from the experiential knowledge of many people who engage in protest action, that municipalities can often be an obstacle when it comes to exercising the right to protest. I had picked up on a particular problem in the wake of Marikana massacre, where I'd seen a number of prohibition letters of protests that had been attempted in the Rustenburg municipal area that pointed to the fact that protests were being prohibited on grounds that weren't recognized by the Regulation of Gatherings Act. And I wanted to know, to what extent was this an emerging national trend? So I put together a research team in order to look at 11 different municipalities in the country in order to answer that particular question.
And in your research, I mean, did you find whether most people in these municipalities, or most people who've been out protesting, and it's been in recent years really, not just only in the past year, whether they were aware, because we're seeing increasingly the call for protest, even when it comes to students, to do it within the limits of the law. Are South Africans aware of what those limits are?
Yes, well, my particular research project focused on a 5-year period. So that allowed us to get, I think, a fairly long-range view of how protests have been conducted over that time. I think that often many people who engage in protest action are aware of their constitutional rights and often have a highly developed knowledge of the Regulation of Gatherings Act. Some don't, but many do. And often one tends to find that activists who are knowledgeable have to school the police and municipalities in what the Act actually says. In fact, one of the major findings that came out of the research was that while largely the municipalities that we studied respected the right to protest, there was a creeping trend of municipalities limiting and even prohibiting protests, particularly protests on grounds that weren't recognized by the Gatherings Act and weren't supported by the Constitution.
Now, Jane, over the past year, increasingly we've seen the question arise as to why are protesters destroying the very things that their communities need? We've seen now with Fees Must Fall, libraries, we've seen HIV clinics, we've seen the damage done to universities. In the past, we've seen it happen with schools, for example, in Vuwane recently. Any answers? I mean, what did you come across in writing your book as to what happens? What is the mindset of a protester who actually does that?
Yes, I must just make the viewers aware that the research actually ended in 2014, so it actually didn't include Vuwane or the student protests. But I think that there are some lessons, salutary lessons, that can be drawn from the research that I think are relevant to the protests that are taking place at the moment. And if we ask and attempt to answer the question, what radicalizes protest action? Well, one of the things certainly I've found is that state non-responsiveness does so. Often many organizations who engage in protest action attempt to use more formalized, more conventional methods or channels of addressing their grievances, like ward committees, for instance, or imbizos, or other formalized structures. And often their voices are ignored. And this then leads to an escalation of protest action. As one activist said to me in an interview, either you let go of your burning issue or you don't. And often people don't have a choice. They're not able to let go of their burning issue because it's a bread and butter issue. Another thing that radicalizes protest action is a broader closure of democratic space. So if municipalities, for argument's sake, limit the right to protest on unreasonable and unlawful grounds, that in turn can create what some social movement theorists have called injustice frames around the state. Because people start to say that if the state itself isn't respecting the law, if the law itself is lawless, then it delegitimizes the state, and it starts to make the case in the minds of some protesters for more radical forms of action that may include violence. But also what often happens as well is that you see a splitting taking place in protest action, where the more moderate sections of protest movements, if one can call it that, tend to get frightened off by these things. Police violence as well also has a major radicalizing effect. But police violence also socializes protesters into violence, and that may leave a small core of increasingly hardened protesters who may engage in acts of increasingly organized violence. This may well be what is unfolding in our universities at the moment.
All right, thanks for that, Professor Jane Duncan, author of the book Protest Nation, The Right to Protest in South Africa.